Hello my loves and welcome back to this tiny bookish corner of the internet. I hope you've been well since my last video. Thank you so much to each and every one of you who left adorable comments on the bottom of the last video. I'm happy to report that the immigration filing went really well. Now I'm just waiting for receipts and then we'll move on from there. But at least that's done and it's kind of out of my control now, which as a person with pretty severe anxiety is actually really terrifying. But I'm trying to let it go and enjoy the freedom from having to prepare a huge file. So thank you to everyone who watched that. A surprising number of you have actually been through the process, which I thought was kind of exciting. And I'm super glad you guys have all found your home here in the greatest country in the world. And with that very unsubtle political aside done, I am going to talk to you today about some audiobook recent reads of mine. Now, as you'll have noticed, I haven't done a traditional wrap-up for quite a while, and that's because they were getting kind of unmanageable in length. I've decided that I'm probably going to do a wrap-up quite soon because I read a lot in May and I count on reading a lot in June. So we'll figure it out. In the meantime, I've kind of been splitting up some of the stuff I've been reading into just slightly smaller recent reads video. So the last one I did, I think, was the double play one, which I will link here in the description below. But today is entirely dedicated to audiobooks, and I have 3 to talk to you about today. The first of those is Girls Will Be Girls by Emer. This book was making the rounds on BookTube. Loads of people absolutely loved it, so I knew I had to pick it up. And I have a soft spot for the Irish accent. I love it. So I knew that, especially given that I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks, I was particularly excited for this one because I knew that it was read by someone with an Irish accent. It's not actually Emer herself, but I was just kind of excited to let it wash over me. This explores gender and feminist theory with a particular focus on the performative aspect of gender. So how we kind of externally show our presentation of gender, and crucially how we can manipulate that in terms of how we can grow into it, how we can kind of play around with it as we grow up and mature into ourselves. What I loved about this book is that it kind of explores the growth into the feminist identity that so many of us have experienced, I think. Some of us are lucky enough to kind of have a bunch of catalytic events that we can pinpoint that kind of led into our feminist discovery of ourselves. But some of us, it was a more gradual process, and a lot of us have realised how far we've grown as feminists and all the stuff that we believed maybe when we were like early teens relative to what we believe now, and how that's changed and how our identities as women have changed, and that kind of cringeworthy feeling that you get when you were like what I like to call a baby feminist relative to what you believe now. And I feel like there's something very real in this book's exploration of that. Emer really manages to describe that and the feelings associated with that and the things she got wrong versus the things she got right. And she manages to do this through a kind of conversational lens that seems very private and like it's letting you into some important piece of her life and her existence of, you know, who she is now. But also, as well as being conversational, it is highly academic and very well researched and very interesting. And the balance between those two things is what I found so great about this book. I feel like it makes it accessible just as much as it is educational, and in non-fiction I feel like that's hard to do. This looks at a huge variety of topics, especially for a book so small, which is another one of its major positives. It looks at matters of choice, so a discussion of agency versus structure, how much we actually have agency in our decisions as women and how much of our decision making is influenced by the structures that we live in, and those structures being patriarchal. And that's a pretty scary discussion to have because people are very polarized in their opinions of that. Those things that we do as women that are entrenched in patriarchal values how much of our actual personal decision is a part of that. So she manages to discuss that with a remarkable level of neutrality, but also just really personally too, all the way to physical presentations of gender, how we dress, body hair, all that stuff. And then, you know, all the way to stuff in her childhood and her kind of first awakenings as a woman and as a feminist, both sexually and in her body, but also, you know, realizing that certain lyrics and songs that she used to get taught at school were sexist, things like that. So, like I say, a huge amount of things discussed, but all things that I think we'll identify with. And even if this doesn't necessarily change our minds about anything, although it might do, depending on how much you've read in terms of feminist texts. But what it does so beautifully is it will give you the words very concisely, very beautifully, hilariously, to explain a lot of those really complicated situations and dichotomies that we find in feminism. Another amazing thing about it that I really loved is how non-patronizing it was. I feel like because it was kind of trying to strike the balance between the conversational and the academic, it could either have been completely impenetrable, or it could have ended up being really patronizing. But one thing that she never did was tell you that she had all the answers, that she had kind of reached the pinnacle of feminist knowledge, that she knew exactly what she was talking about, and that you should just take everything she said at face value, which I think is a problem in feminist discussion. Often whoever is writing is the best kind of feminist there is, and there is no alternative to that. And there was none of that coming from Emer at all. So I really appreciated that too. And I feel like any book that makes talking about this stuff easier and bringing it into your life easier is a gift to us, really. So I agree with everyone else that seems to have reviewed this on BookTube. It was a great one, and I will definitely be passing it on to anyone who hasn't read it. The second audiobook that I'm going to talk to you about is Hag-Seed by Margaret Atwood. Now, as I'm sure you probably know, this is part of the Hogarth Shakespeare series, which is basically a series that commissioned great authors and modern authors to retell Shakespeare in whatever way they wanted. And so fittingly, they gave Margaret Atwood The Tempest, and there have been 1,000,001 retellings of The Tempest and 1,000,001 retellings of Shakespeare, full stop. So when I first heard about this Hogarth series, I was just like, okay, yet another one of these, not gonna, you know, break new ground. Might be great because these are all really great authors. I think Jeanette Winterson has done one, you know, there are so many, and they're all written by great people, but nothing that new. I could not have been more wrong. The only one I've read so far is Hag-Seed, and I absolutely loved it. So I'm going to assume you know the plot of The Tempest, but even if you don't, I really feel that you'll get a lot out of this. I want to stress that you don't need to know Shakespeare, you don't need to be a literature nerd, you don't need to be a Shakespeare nerd. I think you'll enjoy this either way. We follow Felix, whose life is kind of enveloped in tragedy after the loss of his wife and his 3-year-old daughter. He's kind of been left stranded in the middle of the sea, not literally, but he's just enveloped in grief and profoundly upset. But he does take great pride in his recognised career on the Canadian theatre scene. After he's ousted by some pretty awful, manipulative, wily co-workers of his, and loses his job, he kind of becomes more and more of a hermit as the book progresses, and he's living in the cold Canadian countryside in a cabin in the middle of nowhere on his own, and all he has for company are hallucinations of his 3-year-old daughter. He eventually gets a job leading a literacy program in a nearby prison, and he uses the opportunity to figure out a plan to exact revenge on those that have wronged him. So if you have read The Tempest, you're probably getting the kind of overtones, but hopefully you can also see how kind of offbeat and out of left field this retelling is going to be. And I can tell you that's exactly what it is. In typical Atwood fashion, it's super playful. It's a love letter to language and to storytelling. Fucking hell, guys. Like, I had forgotten how good of a writer Margaret Atwood is. Like, I don't know why I had forgotten, because I should bow down to her every single day, but she is so, so good, and this is no exception. The beauty of this, I think, is that the premise could have been really trite. As we said, this has been done to death, and even maybe the premise of her retelling could have maybe been a little bit cliche, a little bit trite, but it really comes off so well. It's hilarious, it's tightly wound, and it isn't without the clear political, social justice-y type points that are characteristic of Atwood, I think. In this case, it's really a call to action to listen to and work with prisoners and treat their education as a matter of urgency and as a human right, really, which they should be entitled to as prisoners, and an education particularly in literacy. Now, I don't know whether this was particularly relevant to me at the time where I listened to it, because I had just been in a prison myself teaching a creative writing workshop, which, if you'd like to hear a bit more about that, I talked about it in the last video. But this bit of the novel really spoke to me, and I feel like it doesn't come across as preachy, the point that she's trying to make, and it comes across loud and clear that she thinks that these prisoners who are living, you know, all around the world and in America and in the UK are entitled to be treated like human beings and to be educated like human beings, and, you know, that this is not the end of their life, and that whatever landed them in prison should not preclude them from being able to learn the things they want to, particularly if they're open to that, which the prisoners end up absolutely being open to Felix and his dramatic teachings in the prison. And in fact, I would argue that they're some of the best parts of the novel. The way in which the prisoners are fleshed out, their dialogue. There's a particularly great sub-premise that they are not allowed to use actual swear words, so they're only allowed to use Shakespearean swear words, which comes across really well and is really endearing and great. Even though it has moments of raucousness, much like it also manages to sit in this really gorgeous quiet and serenity, I think, the novel, particularly the parts between Felix and the hallucinations of his dead daughter, which are incredibly touching. And within that, you know, the novel isn't just a bit of light humour and also a meditation on like the state of prisons in the world. It's also an exploration of grief and its multifacetedness, and how grief can kind of run away with you, and the healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms associated with grief, and real, true, non-saccharine portrayals of grief, I think, are few and far between. And for me, this book really manages that in a beautiful way. I'm just getting such a great Atwood fix right now because I'm watching Handmaid's Tale, which is absolutely brilliant, and she keeps coming up like on my Facebook and stuff, and I love the way she talks, and she's just super smart. And actually, I bought this audiobook for my dad recently for his birthday, and I was talking to him about it the other day because he's enjoying it a lot too, and he said something about it being in the first person, and I said, hang on, wait, no, it's in the third person. And so we had a bit of a discussion about how, because the novel is written from Felix's point of view, it must be so well done, because we both kind of got this feeling for a second that it was written in the first person, and that's just because Felix's voice comes through so strongly and so singularly. So yeah, I highly recommend it, whether you're well versed in The Tempest or not. And our final audiobook review for, oh no, I forgot to say about Hag-Seed, the narrator. Hag-Seed is narrated by a Canadian actor who just does an absolutely amazing job. I will be seeking out some other audiobooks read by him because he's just got a really, really lovely voice, and so I think that makes it even better. So if you want to pick it up, I got it on Audible, not Spawn. And the last audiobook I'm going to talk to you about that I listened to super recently was Autumn by Ali Smith. Now, Ali Smith is kind of Marmite, at least in my anecdotal experience. I know people who absolutely do not get the hype with her, and I know people who will read every single one of her books and love everything she does. I really, really like Ali Smith, and so I was excited for this one. I have never listened to one of her books on audiobook, and because of the way that Ali Smith writes, she also is another one who loves wordplay and loves language, and she throws out convention at the first available opportunity. I was a little bit concerned at first listening to it on audiobook because I tend to have to concentrate quite hard to read her books, and one of the things that bothers me with audiobook listening, but I am persevering, is that I do find that my concentration just kind of like goes off with the fairies, and I have that problem anyway, but not necessarily when I'm reading, because there's something really present for me about reading a physical book. Like, you have to be present in the physical space that you occupy along with the book, and I just lose that entirely with audiobooks. So I have struggled and like had to listen to stuff again, which I really don't like doing. So I was a bit concerned with this one of Ali Smith, but I had gotten rave reviews, specifically from Jen, who absolutely loved it. And she gave a better review than I would ever be able to give at this video here. And I will certainly not be going into as much depth as she did. But this is the first of a quartet, so we'll have all 4 seasons coming out, I guess, over the next couple of years. And it has been said that Autumn is the first great post-Brexit novel. Now, I haven't read any other great post-Brexit novels, so I'm perfectly willing to accept that. We follow 2 characters mainly, and those are Elizabeth and Daniel. Now, Elizabeth is, well, she starts off as a little girl, and she has this next door neighbor named Daniel who is in his 80s, and they kind of strike up some type of friendship where Daniel's teaching Elizabeth a bunch of stuff about the world. This little girl is really intrigued by this old man who is a gay man who knows a lot about art and poetry and all the great things of the creative world. Her mother is immediately horrified that she should be striking up any kind of relationship with a gay man. But so we have explorations of that time in their life when Elizabeth was a little girl and kind of learning things through Daniel, and I guess just like absorbing by osmosis all his knowledge about the world. And then we have present day England, where Daniel is dying, I guess. He is a very, very old man, 101, I think, by that time. And he's in hospice, and Elizabeth, with an S, which I thought is a really cute detail, like she always says, it's Elizabeth with an S, is now an adult, and she's visiting Daniel a lot at the end of his life and kind of remembering a lot of things about her childhood and her relationship with him. So I think one of the reasons why people struggle with Ali Smith is that because she throws convention out of the window, you kind of just have to go with the tide and maybe even accept that you're not going to understand absolutely everything or get absolutely every one of the references, whether they be literary, she loves literary references, or whether they be pop culture references. And I will be the first to admit that I certainly did not get everything that I could have done out of this book. There are certain things that I understood, and in fact I loved finding those little literary Easter eggs. You know, it starts off with a nod to Dickens, for example. There's lots of Shakespearean stuff in there. There's lots of dreamlike sequences that evoke other parts of literature. But I think yeah, she kind of forces you to just like let go of control a little bit. And I think that's really interesting because I think we're kind of unwilling to do that as readers. Like we've only really enjoyed a book or like are capable of reviewing it if we've understood absolutely everything and if we can talk about subtext and all those important things. But actually she lets you know in her writing that that's not very important. I think that for me, this book was an exploration of time. It was an exploration of, in the modern day part, post-Brexit, it was an exploration of racism and all the things that led to Brexit and the massive divide in people in the UK and indeed America. It's a meditation on modern art, on age, on friendships that have a massive age difference, which is always a really interesting thing to explore. I once had a story with a really old woman and a young boy, for example. It's a lot of things, and I think she plays with the timeline. She never really has you in a static time, and I think that's kind of an homage to the fact that every story kind of forces you to put yourself in a certain time. It's about telling stories and leaving something behind and the effect that you have on people after you die and women, and it's just about so much. And I don't even know, I mean, it's probably about something really major that I completely missed. So yeah, I don't know. It made me feel a bit stupid in parts, and I think that's part of the thing with her. And part of the thing with us as readers, we don't like not understanding stuff because it makes us feel stupid and it makes us feel like people who are, quote, more intellectual, unquote, than us would have necessarily understood it in exactly the same way as the author intended. But really, I don't think that's true. My attitude to this book changed a bit actually a couple of nights ago, so well after I read it, when I listened to Ali on Desert Island Discs, which is one of my very favourite shows on Radio 4. It's a brilliant show. And I had never heard her actually talk. I'd never seen her interviewed or anything like that. And it's amazing when you can really place a writer speaking naturally into their writing voice. You can absolutely tell that she is the one who writes her novels. She talks a million miles an hour. She is always talking about storytelling and the importance of storytelling and how our lives are basically stories that we have more or less control over. She talks very, very beautifully, and although she didn't talk very specifically about autumn in this show, it just kind of gave me an understanding for what she was trying to do. So if you do want to pick up autumn, I really recommend that you listen to her episode of Desert Island Discs, which you can get wherever you get your podcasts. Now I sound like a smoker for some reason. I don't know why. Because I just feel like they make really great companion pieces. And yeah, like I said, if you want a more in-depth look at the thematic stuff, you can go to Jen's review, which was a complete joy. So that brings us to the end of our little mini audiobook wrap up. I am not entirely sure still about how I feel about audiobooks. I still feel like I prefer the printed word. I'm still gonna stick with audiobooks because I think they're practical. But I would love it if anyone could recommend any radio play type of audiobooks where there's multiple narrators. I would really, really love that. So please feel free to leave in the comments below. And now I feel really fucking sad and angry that this is literally the second consecutive video I've had to end like this. But I would like to send all my love and all my thoughts to the people affected by the horrible, horrible, horrible attacks in London. I have felt incredibly sad over the past 36 hours or so. London is still home, and the UK has been through enough in the past couple of weeks. It's just senseless and gross and just fuck it, frankly. Truly just done with it. And the thing that upsets me, I think, is that every time this happens, and if you follow me on Twitter, you'll have seen that I tweeted about this last night. Every time this happens, our hearts seem to break along the same lines, and that line in my heart is getting used to breaking. And that just sucks. And I know that it must be like that so much and so many times over for war-torn countries. But I'm sorry. I'm going home to London in 3 days unexpectedly, and I'm going to take my city into my arms and hug it very tightly and remember that it can get through anything. City went through the fucking Blitz, for God's sakes. Like, it's fine. I love you guys. Stay safe. Please treat the comment section as a place where you can vent and feel comfortable to express whatever you want to express, whatever's on your heart. This is an open space. You can swear to your heart's content or not, whatever takes you. And I'm gonna fly away to London real quick, and I will see you super soon. I'm gonna do a quick fire wrap up, I think, and a special video with the disembodied voice of my husband behind the camera. He is gonna sit in front and do one with me. In the meantime, drink alcohol if you're that way inclined, read books, and eat food. Love you all.